Welcome to the Real Photo Show. My guest today is Leonard Marcus, and we are going to talk about children's books, the history of children's books, the use of photography in children's books, and especially something that I really loved when speaking with Leonard, the idea of children's books as objects of art. And on that topic, this is attached to a show that Leonard curated at the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art called Click, Photographers Make Picture Books, of which Leonard is a founding member. So let's talk a little bit more about Leonard, who is a children's book historian, author, and critic. And for those of you watching, you may have noticed that I am just showing you things on a screen instead of staring at my face. I thought that might be a more interesting way to introduce the show. It also lets me read off some pages and keep track of what I'm talking about in maybe a more interesting way. Leonard's pathfinding writings and exhibitions have earned him acclaim as one of the world's preeminent authorities on children's books and the people who create them. He is the author of more than 25 award-winning biographies, histories, interview collections, and inside looks at the making of children's literature's enduring classics. His reviews have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Washington Post, The Horn Book. He has been on Good Morning America, All Things Considered, the PBS NewsHour, and many more things. He teaches at New York University and the School of Visual Arts and speaks to audiences like us. And it's just a fantastic conversation. I actually scrolled through some of his books during the podcast as well, but here they are. He's really just a wonderful person to speak with, and I love talking about not only the history of children's books, but the history of photography. But before we get to that, this podcast is sponsored by the Charcoal Book Club. Begin building or continue to build your dream photo book library today at charcoalbookclub.com. There are two recent books that have been on the show. Maputo Diary, I did a reel for on the Real Photo Show Instagram. Maputo Diary brings together 25 years of photographic work from Mozambique's capital, Maputo, the city where Herlov Jonsson herself grew up during the Civil War and has subsequently returned to over the past 2 decades. The other book, which is coming up, is Stone Soup by Eric Ruby. Eric will be on the show soon, and as soon as I get the book, I will do a reel on that as well. It is published by Nocturno Books and our friend Brad Zeller. Stone Soup brings together Eric Ruby's photographs from the past decade and presents them collaged on fabrics from his personal collection. The results are a maximalist, colorful aesthetic that creates playful and unexpected visual harmonies. Also, at the JKC Gallery, up right now, a show by Mel Leipzig. Mel Leipzig is was a professor emeritus at Mercer County Community College. He taught art there for a very long time, and he recently passed. We have on display some of his jazz paintings with a reception this Wednesday, February 18th at 5 p.m., and a jazz performance on Saturday, February 20th. So check that out, or just keep track of things here at JKC Gallery on the Instagram account. I'll be retiring the website soon. I don't think we get that much traffic on it. I think we get much more here at JKC Gallery. The next show to come up after Mel Leipzig show is by Lily Coleman. It's called She Archivist, including some featured work from her new publication, Frame Sequence. So there'll be a lot of great work in that show and a bunch of talks. But, stay tuned here at JKC Gallery on Instagram. Please follow, and you'll be able to stay on top of when things are happening. All right, everyone. I think that's it. I hope you enjoyed my little show here on my websites. So thank you for listening. Enjoy the show, and we will talk soon. Well, hi, Leonard Marcus. Thanks for joining me here.
Hi, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
This is a very different kind of show. You are a children's book historian, critic, writer, curator, and all. So why don't you just introduce yourself? Tell us how you get into children's book history and everything else you do.
Sure. Well, I mean, when I started doing this work, I was an undergraduate history student, and there wasn't really a career or a category that somebody could aspire to becoming involved in. But I got interested in history viewed generationally, what one generation wants to pass on to the next one. I realized that children's books from the past would be a great way of looking at that, because children's books are the record of our hopes and dreams. And over time, and from culture to culture, they vary quite a bit. So that was the beginning. But those old books that I was looking at from the early 19th century were not very interesting visually or even as literature. They were more like x-rays of a society's
Hmm.
values. So I started hanging out in bookstores looking at contemporary books, discovered people like Maurice Sendak and William Steig, realized there was this incredible body of artwork that hadn't been written about all that much, and certainly not shown in art museums. So I really saw this as a great chance to write about something that was somewhat underexplored.
Yeah. Well, where did there must have been a moment in your life, right? You were thinking about college or other things.
Mhm.
When does that actually click?
Well, I needed to write a big paper to graduate from undergraduate school, and this is when the necessity comes to your aid when you're in a desperate situation. So I had the idea to write about early American children's books. So I was looking at the books that were published in the decades right after the American Revolution, as a new society was being made. So that's when it started, and I had absolutely no thought that this could lead anywhere for me beyond graduation. But in a few years after that, I realized how much I loved writing about the books, and began and had always wanted to be a writer from the time I was probably 6 years old. So I thought, well, here's a subject to write about. And first I did some book reviewing, and then that grew into a bigger, like a full monthly column at a magazine that was read by a lot of people. And at a certain point, I thought, why not write a book? And growing up, the kind of book that I most loved myself was biography. And by chance, I stumbled on a picture book in a bookstore that I'd never heard of before, called Goodnight Moon, and became intrigued by the backstory of that book, who had written it, who had illustrated it. And that became my first book in the field. And it opened up in many, many directions for me.
That's really incredible. I've heard you say in other talks how children's books and children's book literature is art, and we should be talking about it as art.
Mhm.
And just like art, it is a reflection of where we are in our culture. It responds to big national tragedies or celebrations or changing life events. It responds to um, taste, and it responds to cultural shifts. And so I thought it was really fascinating to hear you talk about it the same way we talk about art, the same way we talk about
Mhm.
photography.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I was coming of age as a student and a young writer, it was still the time of abstract expressionism. So the big art world wasn't interested in art that told a story. So, and illustration in general was considered very low, on a low rung on the ladder of art. So I realized that in itself was part of the historical story, the backstory of children's book art. And there was no, reason to look at it as lesser than an oil painting or a sculpture. It would just happen to evolve that way for various reasons. So I saw it as a kind of art that needed more focus, and as I began to pay more attention to what had been done, just in this country, let alone in the whole world, I realized there was an extraordinary number of artists, and I began meeting them. And some of the ones who I met, who were a generation or two behind me, who came of age when nobody was even asking these questions, had closets full of art that they didn't know what to do with, because no museum was interested, no gallery was interested, and there were almost no collectors. So between then, the 1970s and now, there's been a whole revolution in the way people think about these things, and that's been very satisfying to be a part of.
Yes, and you've spoken about how integration has affected literature, and the sort of early attempts to include Black culture in books,
Hmm.
and how those attempts didn't do well. Uh,
No.
but but thinking about this in the long arc of Black culture and LGBTQ, and kind of where we are now in maybe the greatest political divide. And this is not a political show, and I'm not looking
Hmm.
for politics, but have you seen kind of the same concerns, or the same things that writers and artists try to attempt to create these stories, create these books? with either a great appeal or trying to, work with a shifting ideology, shifting ideas. Have you seen this a kind of repetition in history of the way that works?
Well, every generation has certain issues that it cares most about, and they typically do show up one way or another in children's books. In the case of America's relationship to the question of race, I noticed that for going back to around 1900, every 20 years, someone would come along and recognize that we were essentially publishing an all-white literature, and that didn't, match with the society that we actually were living in. And those efforts would be interesting, but then they would sort of fizzle, and then 20 years later, the next one would come along.
Hmm.
And in fact, in 1960s, a book that is pretty well known called The Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats won the Caldecott Medal. And that seemed like a great victory for people who were hoping to see the literature become more diverse. But, history is complicated and change doesn't often happen very quickly. And when people saw that as success, a lot of people said, well, we've taken care of that issue now. So as if that one book solved the whole issue, the whole problem, as it were. But it's in the last 10 or 15 years, I think, we've really come to grips with the question of race in children's books. And of course, only to be met by a reaction, which we're
Right.
living through right now.
Right. Great
Yeah,
resistance right now,
yeah,
which,
yeah,
yeah, it always complicates
yeah,
progress. Yes.
yeah. I love the thing that President Obama said once. He said, sometimes history moves sideways.
Hmm.
We think of it as all about forward or backward, but sometimes it's kind of somewhere in a different direction, and we have to, I suppose, be a little bit patient for things
Yeah.
to come together.
The other thing you've spoken, written about, of course, is how the artwork itself has changed. And we should mention you're a founding board member of the
Hmm.
Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art.
Hmm.
And the reason why we're talking is you have an exhibition that you curated called "Click Photographers Make Picture Books." So
Hmm.
for those of you wondering what the connection was to this show, that's the
Yeah,
connection. But before we get to that, I do love the history that you've
sure.
sort of set out for children's books, and one of the big changes in illustration came after Maurice Sendak starts writing books, creating books,
Hmm.
and there is this idealism of almost like I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, like a Victorian idea of childhood being used for illustrations in many stories, and the princess idea, all those things. But Maurice Sendak actually starts creating illustrations that seem like these are real kids, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and style is part of it, but that's only as maybe even a small part of
Mm.
the change that he brought about. I would say that in past generations preceding him, one of the main thoughts or goals of children's books was to create a protected environment for children, um, so that they would retain a certain kind of innocence in terms of their awareness of the harsher realities and the more disturbing emotions internally that is part of being human. Sendak came along, in the 60s when there was a lot of change going on in society, more awareness of psychology than ever before. It's becoming very mainstream in college classes and so on. And his argument was always, you can't protect children because they're just too aware, and it's kind of a false idea of some adults that you can cordon wall kids off from a knowledge of loneliness, a knowledge of fear, a knowledge of the things that happen in the world, on cruelty toward each other, for instance. It's all on the playground, if you take even a cursory look. So on top of that, the characters presented in children's book illustration tended to be sort of idealized, and sort of living in a sunny world. You could think of Golden Books, or maybe the Dick and Jane readers of the 1950s, which were an all-white cast of characters, to get back to the race question for a moment. And Sendak was, the son of Polish immigrant Jews living in lower middle-class circumstances in Brooklyn. And he knew that the kids in those older books didn't look anything like he did. And he took a more realistic approach. I mean, he drew what model agencies called realies, people who are not the perfect
Oh, I
examples
didn't know
of,
that was
of,
a
of
term.
humanity, more
Yeah.
like character actors, and his idea was that children should look at a book and not feel they were viewing an impossible ideal that they could never live up to. They should see a reflection, some sort of reflection of themselves, so that's what his style came out of. And I think more than a style, it was a vision, of childhood as a time of great resilience, but also of great vulnerability, and books. A bookmaker had the opportunity to create stories which effectively give a shape to the most, amorphous feelings and experiences that children invariably have, as they're just beginning to gather all their faculties together and learn how to make sense of the world for themselves.
The other parallel I see with the children's book history and photography is uh, the photo book became a way that more people could access photography and fine art in a way that painters and sculptors and others didn't really have in terms of the abundance of photo books that
Hmm.
in the last 10 years, let's say. There is a photo book community, there's a photo book culture, and you mentioned that children's in another talk, children's books, there were these very low cost reprints that made children's book also more accessible
Hmm.
for the general population, right?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, there were certain kinds of books that came along in the 30s and 40s as printing technology became more sophisticated, color became less expensive for printers to use, and um, new marketing techniques, led to children's books being sold in drugstores and five and dime stores and eventually supermarkets. So there was a big democratization of children's books going on during the 20th century. And one thing about photography, which is kind of related to all that, is in 1900, the Brownie camera went on the
Hmm.
market from Eastman Kodak. It cost just $1. And if you look at all the advertising for that time, they were urging parents to take pictures of their children at home. They were also urging parents to give children their own Brownie cameras. So kids were becoming enfranchised as photographers at that point. And the most popular children's magazine from around then opened up a feature for kids to submit their photographs so that they could be, put into print, which is, as I recall, is a very exciting thing when you're 9 or 10 years old to see something you've done published for
Yes.
all to see.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the kid, I think that one of the reasons that photographically illustrated children's books started proliferating in the early 20th century was that kids felt so connected to the making of that very kind of image.
That's right. And Lartigue is famously known as being a childhood photographer and
Yes,
making some of the
right.
most exciting, sort of free spirited photos at the
Yeah,
time. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, that's a wonderful story in itself.
Absolutely. Um, the last thing I'll ask in terms of what you've seen in terms of history, you mentioned about how television changed attention spans and changed storytelling.
Hmm.
And my kids grew up with Nuffle Bunny. My kids grew up with Mo Willems and
Hmm.
Percy Jackson and Captain Underpants. I'm
Hmm.
blanking on the author.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, Dave Pelkey.
Dave Pelkey, of course, still
Yeah,
still
yeah,
creating
yeah.
great work.
Oh, yeah.
And of course they're the generation after television. They're the generation that starts being influenced by screens and by mobile
Hmm.
devices and
Hmm.
constant attention towards screens. But so how do you see it now in terms of how the storytelling is being made?
Well, if we talk about picture books, books for younger kids that often have 32 pages,
Hmm.
if you were making a picture book in the 30s or 40s, like Make Way for Ducklings, your story, the text might be 1,000 or 1,500 words long. Now, if you were to submit a story that long, you would never get it read in a publishing house. The new rule of thumb is 500 words or less. So there's a kind of shrinking of the text that corresponds to what I guess people perceive to be the shrinking attention span of
Hmm.
young generation. the other hand, if you're really good at writing like that, you are basically a poet.
That's right.
If you can,
That's right.
and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like Margaret Weiss Brown from the 40s and 50s was one of the great poets for children, and she wrote very tersely worded stories, but they
Hmm.
were full of humor and insight and vivid imagery and meaning. So
And what's
maybe
more
that's
powerful than a short story that takes you through 3 acts, right?
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, I think, in about 15 years ago, an article appeared on the first page of the New York Times announcing the death of the picture book, saying that from now on, kids would only be getting their stories from their phone screens. And they most likely wouldn't even be picture book stories because parents were so worried about their future, they were pushing them into reading longer books at an earlier age. But that all turned out to be not true. And
Hmm.
particularly the part about picture books, because it turns out that people get sort of exhausted by digital media, and they long to hold something in their hand and to turn the pages, sort of luxuriate in the texture of paper. And, maybe more importantly than that, to have it be a shared experience with an older, caretaker, parent, or whoever. And, with a kind of hugging and embrace going on while
Oh,
you're also looking at a
the
story.
readings, the
What could
reading
be
together
better,
stories it's
Yeah,
one of the most bonding experiences. Every parent knows this, but yeah, it's
yeah,
one of the most bonding, memorable experiences you'll have with your
yeah.
kid. Yeah, yeah.
So what you see is a real counter trend in publishing toward more beautifully produced books where the materiality of the book is taken into greater consideration and becomes a really a unique experience on a sensory level for everyone involved, on top of whatever the story has to say. And that in a way makes a segue to talking about museums, because I think when people go to museums, they're also looking to be in the
I
presence of something
no. Yeah,
special
yeah.
in
So
exactly
just
precisely the same
we'll get
way.
to the show
Yeah,
right now, but
yeah.
viewers will see behind me. I'm in a classroom. I just dismissed a class. We just made cyanotypes all day.
Oh,
So students
okay.
really do crave that tactile, making right now,
Uh-huh.
and
Yeah.
reading and everything else. And no, it couldn't be more true than what just happened in this classroom right now. Yeah.
No.
So let's talk about the show. Let's talk about the
Sure.
museum. Tell us about how it
Sure.
started.
Well, it started over 20 years ago. Eric Carle, who I got to fortunately to know because I was a trustee from the very beginning, visited Japan. His books were known all over the world, and Japan was one of the places he was venerated. And he was surprised to find out when he went there in the 1980s that there was already a museum devoted to children's book art in Tokyo. There was nothing like that in the US and probably anywhere in the West at that point. He probably realized that because of Japan and China having a long visual narrative art history, scrolls and art of that kind, telling stories going back centuries, that those Asian cultures would have been maybe more quick to recognize the interest of having a museum devoted to children's book illustration. Anyway, he became determined to change the situation in the US and ended up founding a museum in Amherst, Massachusetts, which is not only about his work, but it's about the entire art form of the picture book.
And you're involved from the beginning.
Yes,
Were
yeah.
you were you invited? Was it just a joint idea? How did it all come together?
Well, I had published a number of books about children's literature at that point, and Eric and his wife Barbara, who was the original chair of the board, realized they needed to have someone on the board who knew an awful lot about this, the subject of children's illustration. And Eric and I had an editor in common at HarperCollins, and so she recommended me, and then we got together and we really liked each other. So it became the beginning of this very long collaboration. And one of the things that Barbara said to me was, I want you to be on the board for life. So I
Wow.
thought, okay, that sounds great. What could be better? And I've
Yeah.
really loved the experience because I'd never seen the inner workings of a museum before. After decades of going to museums is one of my very favorite things to do. So to have that chance to be involved in the founding and the growth and the life of a museum has been really thrilling.
Yeah. And we're gonna show some of the slides while we're talking for those who are watching and who want to watch later. But you have work from Saxton Freeman, Nina Cruz, Peter Buckley. And I'm reading off a list now, and there's some of them are
Hmm.
the authors, some of the illustrators, Tana Hoban, Roger Mello, Shelley Rotner, William Wegman, Walter Wick, Mo Willems, Peng Yi, and the last one, is it pronounced Ela?
Yes,
That I
that's
have
right.
Ela. Yeah, yeah. And you know, can you talk about then how you go about curating? I mean, it's I don't know if it's a very much more extensive list, or it's a fairly condensed list. How do you then select who's in the
Ah,
show?
well, I mean, I began reviewing children's books in the 1980s, and I soon got into the position where publishers were sending me everything they were doing. And for various reasons, partly just personal interest, I began paying special attention to photographically illustrated books. My first favorite children's book growing up was a book with photographs in it. It was a golden book, and it was about a boy and his sister who had a dog as a pet. And there were these color photos of them having fun. My mother wouldn't let us have a dog at home, so I used to, pore over this book. And at night, I would dream about the book, and it would be like that movie Sherlock Jr. with Buster Keaton, where he steps into the screen of the movie. I would
Mm-hmm.
sort of put myself into the pictures of that book. So I think I learned from that experience just how powerful the realistic images of photographs can be, and how they can somehow speak to a child's, very strong longings, because I certainly felt it's a very emotional thing for me at the time. So that could be one of the reasons that I began paying attention. And also, I think kids are temperamentally different in terms of what kinds of books most appeal to them. And I was definitely a born nonfiction reader. And I realized that photography is the nonfiction of the visual realm. Of all visual mediums, it's the one that's closest to a book which tries to give the true story about something. So it appealed to me in a very, very basic way, photography. So I got to know the sort of the landscape of what was being done, certainly what was being published in America. And I got to travel after a while to the Bologna Book Fair, which happens every spring, which is a gathering of children's book people from all over the world. And they're showing their new books and sometimes also featuring their older ones. So I began to have more of almost a global vision of photography in children's books. And I realized that it was a kind of a big subject, and one that wasn't talked about very much. In fact, no photographer has ever won the Caldecott Medal, which is the major U.S. prize for illustration. And it's not coincidental that that's the case. When you talk to the librarians who are the prize givers, the judges, they don't see photography as being quite on the level. And the argument that was generally made against photography was that it's too literal minded. It's basically just a piece of reality. Where is the art in that?
Where's
And
the
of course,
fantasy? Right, right.
well, where's the fantasy, and even where is the who? How, in a painting, you're shaping it
Mm-hmm.
from zero.
You're talking
Whereas
about the
with a
perennial conversation as photography is not art.
well, right, yeah, and I know that goes back to the 19th century, um, and as I learned, I mean, some of the early photographers like Henry Peach Robinson, got into staging photographs in a very elaborate way. And I presume part of the motivation for doing that was to show people that there was something really complicated and dramatically powerful going on or potentially in a photograph. And I noticed that happened in the children's book realm starting in the late 19th century. We have some books in the show that go back as far as 1893. One where children and a woman in a Mother Goose costume were all dressed up to reenact classic nursery rhymes. And these books were very much, I think, influenced by photographers like Henry Peach Robinson. They were, beautifully printed, and there was a real kind of art striving behind them. They wanted to be thought of as art. And then there were other early photographers who were, putting little caps on cats and dogs and producing something very similar to vaudeville, in the form of books for children. So there was that, and then of course there was the documentary approach to photography, which went back to the 19th century, where you have the impulse is to present children who are relatively new to the world to all sorts of sites and
Mm-hmm.
people and stories that they have yet to discover for themselves.
That's
And
a really
photography,
interesting comparison. The idea that photography was also about opening up children to new ideas, new thoughts,
oh
and
yeah,
new culture, all that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I
Yep.
mean, in the 19th century, there were a lot of travel books, so they were taking children photographically to, relatively exotic parts of the world that they may not have had a chance to see for themselves. There were books about animals and plants and the natural world in all its abundance and variety, so on. So people were experimenting with different uses for photography in a children's book. And my show is organized in three groupings based on those three approaches. There's the documentary part. There's what I call photo theater, the posed pictures, which later became digitally altered images. And then the third section really began, or a third approach to photography began in the 30s with a book by, of all people, Edward Steichen, which
Hmm.
he made in collaboration with his grown daughter, who was a young mother and had visited one of the major centers of progressive education in America, the Bank Street School in Greenwich Village, and became fascinated by their understanding of the way young children view the world. And the basic idea was that they're not interested in once upon a time stories about the world. They want to know about the world they find themselves in. And it could just be what's on the street down the corner from where they live, or it could even be, the things that are in their own house. So Steichen made a photograph of 24 objects that he thought, and his daughter thought any 2-year-old would recognize. And these were like portraits. They were very straight on, and they occupied the right-hand side of each page of this book. The left-hand side, where you'd expect to find some words about the picture, was left blank. And that was a nod to another progressive education idea that a book should try to draw the child in as a collaborator any way it could. So rather
Hmm.
than tell the child in words what to think about the picture, the idea was you talk about it at home. You decide, or maybe draw your own picture on the blank page, which some kids we know did. You know,
Hmm.
so Steichen launched what has come to be called the concept book. Sometimes they're alphabet books, like a picture of 2 rabbits followed by a picture of 3 cars, let's say. And they're not all photographically illustrated, but many of them are. They're accounting books. And then it's really great street photographer Tana Hoban came along in the 1970s. She had been doing portrait photography primarily and had been shown twice at the Museum of Modern Art. So she really had quite a good career going for herself when she became intrigued with the idea that she could make relatively simple photographic picture books for young children that would sort of focus their attention on the everyday world and help them to develop an understanding of really the most basic concepts, like the difference between large and small, up and down, things that 2, 3, 4-year-olds are grappling with as they try to make sense of everything all at once. So she made over 50 books of that kind. And, visually they're, I think, pretty striking. She was not a sloppy photographer in the least. She was making beautiful images, but they were always in the service of presenting an idea in the clearest possible way to a young reader, and of course to anyone else who might come along to enjoy the pictures. So those were the three sides to this big subject that I isolated in order to bring some clarity to it. And in each instance, I found several photographers who work in that way, some from the past, some from the present.
That's what I was going to ask. In that division of three, there's chronological overlap. Then.
Well, that's right. Interesting, just as another example of the documentary photography. Of course, by then Life magazine had come along in the 30s, but then in the 50s, World War II had just ended, and people were thinking about how to make the world a more peaceful place for the future by addressing children's needs in various special ways. And children's books were seen as an opportunity. And so in Sweden, a Astrid Lindgren, the author of Pippi Longstocking, was
Hmm.
also a very powerful editor of children's books in Sweden at the time. She had the idea to bring a photographer and a writer together to make photo essays about the everyday lives of children in different countries around the world. So they started a series beginning with a little girl living in Lapland, in Scandinavia.
Hmm.
And they published this book in an edition of 25,000 copies, which was quite a lot in
Yes.
Swedish. And
Wow.
then it
Yeah.
went into 18 foreign editions. And there were, I think, something like 15 different volumes in the series. So it had this enormous reach coming out of little Sweden, where the population was probably 3 or 4 million at the time. And it brought an American Imitator, another series from here by this sort of swashbuckling friend of Ernest Hemingway named Peter Buckley, who loved to travel and made a series of books, starting with one that we have a number of photographs from in the show. The book is called Cesare, that's like Caesar of Italy, story of a boy living in a mountaintop village where his father is a shoemaker. And, you see all these images that look like they came right out of The Bicycle Thieves, one of those early
Sure.
Italian post-war realist
Great
films.
film. Yeah. Yeah.
His life, his friends. He goes to school. He meets the priest. He's with his mother. He's with his father, learning to make shoes. All these things captured in photographs. So photography was seen as the way to engage children in important ideas. In that case, the idea that we should all live peacefully together. So that became another one of its important uses
Absolutely.
for children's books.
That sense of a morality play or ethical conversations or how to be a good son or daughter or
Hmm.
how to be a good person in society in general, right?
Hmm.
Those are things that have been in children's books since there were children's
Oh,
books,
yes,
right?
that's right. And I think the big change that happened was to never forget the importance of having something of value to communicate in a children's book, but to do it in a way that the child feels respected and not being lectured to. So children's books historically over the last 100 years became more playful. They sort of hid the lesson part in a kind of game-like spirit. And that, I think we would probably all agree, is the best way to learn anyhow, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So it children's books sort of came more into line with the real psychology of childhood, I think.
Yeah. And a huge part, of course, is the psychology. And I wonder if you've delved into sort of the psychological principles of the day influencing children's books, or the connection to the current or modern or contemporary psychology and children's books. Is that something that has been part of your research over the years?
Oh, yeah. It's a really big part of it. I mean, we've talked about the way that children's books reflect and sometimes help to shape social values, but they also respond to and illustrate or demonstrate developmental psychology. You
Hmm.
know, like if you think of a book like Goodnight Moon or the Steichen book I mentioned, which has photographs in it, those are books for very, very young children who think of their immediate surroundings as the world. It's their world. It's what they know. So, I mean, Goodnight Moon is all about the things in a child's bedroom. That's what Steichen's book was about too, essentially. And then you move out from there, and Lewis Hine made a photographically illustrated children's book in 1932, and most of he had been hired by somebody to document the building of the Empire State Building. So that was a project that had nothing to do with children's books per se, but the chance came along to make a children's books from some of those photographs. And that was the book called Men at Work, published in
That's right.
1932.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Men
and
sitting out on the I-beams, eating their
that's right.
lunches. That's right.
That's
Yeah.
right. And there's sort of they're amazing images. Like if you start to try to imagine what it would be like to be sitting in the position of those workers, but from a say an 8-year-old's child's point of view, which is roughly the audience, the beginning of the audience for that book, it's all about being capable, doing things in the real world, trying to be heroic in some way, trying to be good at what you do. Those are the things that kids in 3rd and 4th grade are completely obsessed with, because it's part of the building of their evolving identity, to start to want to emerge from the sort of kittenish protective experience of being coddled by parents when you're 2 or 3, and now you want to kind of show your oats and be your own person more and more. So a book like Men at Work was developmentally really on target, on top of being a story about something fascinating that had happened in the world.
Yeah. I imagine this show must have crossover appeal, um, from artists, photographers, illustrators, and writers, and
Hmm.
children's book writers, as well as other writers, and but also pop culture appeal as well. I imagine. Have you gotten a sense of the audience that's been engaged in this show?
Well, I think it's it's just open, so it's a little soon to say,
Okay, too
but
soon to tell. Yeah,
yeah,
but in
but I
general,
think
I mean, a children's book as the object has that same
yeah.
appeal, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, Aperture is writing something about the show. So that shows that the photography community, is
Hmm.
taking this aspect of photographic illustration in books seriously, which is to me absolutely thrilling. And I know that, the Amherst, where the museum is located, is surrounded by 5 colleges, and all of which have art departments. And I think some of the photography people are coming over to have a look.
Hmm.
Historically, Life magazine and Look magazine in the mid 20th century were presented great opportunities for documentary photographers. But as those magazines have become either disappeared or become more marginal to the overall publishing scene, many of those same photographers migrated to the children's book world. So I think photographers who do find their way to the show may discover there's a new and very valid, very expressive opportunity for them to show their work in the medium of the children's picture book.
You started to talk about the importance of the children's book in your own life as a child. I think you also
Mhm.
mentioned you had difficulty reading at one point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the beginning. Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
I was very verbal. I mean, I had a big vocabulary and I like to show it off, which is sort of funny. But I had also a very stern kindergarten teacher that may have had something to do with it. But
Mm,
I really resisted. I just couldn't get, whatever the unlock the key that you have to do to begin to read on my own. So I really did struggle with it, and I think it. I had a reading instructor who saw that I loved words, so she asked me to write little poems for her to read the following week. Because I had written them myself, I had no trouble reading them. So that was the beginning of feeling some success as a reader, and also the beginning of my thinking of reading and writing as completely, interconnected.
mhm.
So I think it has a lot to do with why I became a writer, actually. But maybe photographs, being the realest images there are, somehow were the easiest for me to connect with. That could very well be.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I mean, you clearly have a real sense of photographic history,
mhm.
and so when we know how you get into children's books, but when did the appeal or the interest in photography and learning more about that, did that come at the same time as children's book? Was that just and because of your interest in picture books that happened as well?
Well, I mean, as a reader, reading biography and history in general, there were more and more books to be had by the time I
Mm,
was in third or fourth grade that had photographs in them. And, I was born at the right time to have heard a lot of war stories from the Second World War from my parents' generation. And I was really fascinated with that history for years, and so I couldn't really get enough of photographs. And once I had a camera and I took a picture of the picture on the cover of Life magazine. It was a picture of President Johnson in the Oval Office, and I thought if I take a picture of the picture, it's sort of like me taking a picture of him. So
that's
it
a
became
you were getting a pretty sophisticated conceptual photographer back
yeah.
then.
Well, I but somehow there was a kind of real magic to sort of appropriating that image and making it my own in some way. So,
Oh yes.
I think I don't think I could have verbalized what I was doing, but I knew I was grappling with something.
That's
And I was
fantastic.
finding
Yeah.
photographs of really fascinating body of material to sort of get involved with one way or
Mhm.
another.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Did you you have clearly a real mix of genre in the show, from
Hmm.
documentary to
Yes.
surrealism to
Yes.
uh,
Hmm.
constructed imagery. Do
Yes.
you see that the kind of photography used in the book is very much tied to the way the story is being told? I mean, obviously it's also an editing decision, right? Publishing editing decision.
Well, I mean, I think most of the photographers, maybe all of the photographers who are represented in the show, are in the position of coming up with a concept for a book and then finding someone who will allow them to realize it. You
Mm,
know, it's rare. I mean, like if you're a commercial illustrator, you might get the assignment of drawing, a corn cob, or something
right. Right.
that is being about to be sold. But I don't think photographers work that way for children's books. They start with a project and then they find an opportunity for
That
themselves.
connection's made later. Right.
Yeah.
Right, right, right.
Um,
But what I was asking is if you see someone who constructs images like William Wegman, or someone
mhm,
who takes documentary work, do you see
mhm.
a tie into the kind of storytelling that's also being told, the pairing with a certain kind of author?
Well, I mean, Wegman did work with a writer, but I think,
Mm, that's
you
right.
know,
Yeah.
I think I mean, he would be another example of someone who had a vision for what he wanted to do, and the writer kind of pulls up the rear in a sense, and it serves really kind of as a straight man,
Hmm.
in
No,
a
that's an interesting idea. Yeah, 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 yeah.
as would happen in a comic, duo like Abbott and Costello. Because I mean, and what Wegman did with the fairy tales is really incredible, I think,
Hmm.
because I mean they're funny, sure, and they're send-ups of familiar stories, but they're also a kind of social commentary. We from Cinderella, we got this awful image of the perfect young woman who has
Right.
to wait for the prince to come along for her to realize her destiny, and
Hmm.
a lot of girls have grown up into women who had a lot of unhappiness by trying to, wait
Right.
or
Those
to somehow
unrealistic
live up.
ideal
Exactly. Yeah,
expectations. Yeah, yeah.
right.
That's right. Yeah.
And it just puts it on a different level, and you can explain it to some degree, what's going on in these pictures, but there's something kind of inexplicable, in the sense that surrealism kind of short circuits your ability to reason about images and puts you into a kind of dream state. I think Wegman's images do that also. So I think they kind of open up the imagination of the viewer in a way that, really good art always does.
Yeah, yeah. Some of my earliest memories with my mother is being read to and all, and that there's that foundation to that. Do you have that connection, those memories as well as a child?
Oddly, not so much.
Hmm.
I was the youngest of three children, and my mother was a very responsible person in many, many ways, but reading to me at night was not one of them. So, so I was kind of left to my own devices with a shelf full of hand-me-down picture books that I spent a lot of time poring over, and one of them was the photo book that I mentioned, which was called Laddie and the Little Dog,
Hmm.
and another was a book that was drawn with paintings of some kind, showing a child what you could do when you grow up. It was all about different job opportunities, basically, which
Yeah.
my older relatives were always asking about. That was their default question, that when they didn't know what to say to me when I was standing there at a party, what are you going to do when you grow up? So this book was the answer to my prayers, and as I look back, I I boiled it down to gas station attendant or cowboy.
So, an interesting coincidence there. We didn't have a lot of children's books or books in general in our house.
Yes,
It wasn't
right,
a family, and um, when my mother was reading to me, sometimes it was like out of a newspaper. Right?
right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I mean, when I think of it, if you were to ask me what was my favorite picture book when I was growing up, I would probably say Life magazine.
Hmm.
Because they came every week. I would pore over the photographs. They were about all sorts of things. and it was my window on the world, literally, and
Yes.
there was nothing in it that was beyond my comprehension. I mean,
Hmm.
maybe I didn't understand every single thing, but it really felt like it was as much for me as for anyone else.
I grew up with a TV Guide and Reader's Digest.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah,
mean, that's part of the short list along with National Geographic of
that's
what
right.
just about everybody had at home.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, so I think, I mean, as a reviewer, as a parent, and in every aspect of my connection to children's books, I have become a lot more flexible about even what you consider a children's book.
Hmm.
Because it's really whatever is at hand. There are these really amazing works of art that most children respond to, but my son really didn't like Goodnight Moon, and I had spent 10 years writing a biography about the author of that book, so I was a little taken aback by that. But
Oh no, you
but
can't pick your children's books all the time. That's right.
no, but the bottom line was, no book is good for every child,
That's
and
right.
that's the most important thing to realize, and to go with the child's preference, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah. Do you have
Yeah.
some new favorite authors?
Well, I mean, not new, but in
Mhm.
recent times, I think Mo Willems has
Yeah,
emerged as one of the
love
absolutely
Mo
great
Willems.
great people of our time, and
Mhm.
there are 3 Knuffle Bunny books, it's a series of 3, and each one, I mean, he just zeroes in on a moment in a young child's life, which is pivotal, and he presents it in a funny way and in an absolutely true way. The first one is it's the beginning of speech, and it's
Mhm.
because the little child in the pictures has lost her favorite doll, and she's she throws a tantrum, but she's literally speechless until finally she can say the name of the doll at the very last page. And then the second one is, about the same girl, a little bit older, going to school for the first time, bringing that same doll, discovering that somebody else has a doll just like it, which blows her mind because she thought it
That's
was the
right.
only one in existence. So suddenly, this child is learning something about, not being the center of the universe, which is something else we all have to learn.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
anybody who can do that and do it in a way that everybody enjoys is really a master, you
Absolutely.
know.
I really do think I see a direct line from Mo Willems books and my kids' sense of humor as well,
Yeah,
and what they're
not
interested in now. Yeah.
not
Yep.
surprising. Yeah,
Mhm.
and a photographer who's continuing to work, has been doing books by now for probably 20 or more years. Walter Wick,
Mhm.
um, has started working for Will Shortz, now the
The
New York
Puzzle
Times
Master.
puzzle. That's right. But before that, he was the editor of something called Games Magazine, and Walter would do these setup photographs that posed sort of visual puzzles for the viewer to the reader of the magazine. And Walter he's just a detail freak, and he's able to produce these very elaborate arrays of tiny objects that visually just they have shadows and they have beautiful lighting, and everything about them is just vibrant,
When I was
and
showing some of the work from the museum to my students earlier, they knew the I Spy image
oh
right
yeah,
away,
yeah,
right
yeah.
away. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yep.
And they do have a developmental component.
Mhm.
Educators have noticed that it helps children develop their attention span and their ability to discriminate between things that look somewhat alike but aren't the same, and to search for something. And the list goes on and on about what those books are good for if you want to look at it that way. But I mean, if a children's book is just like medicine, I don't think it's doing its job.
Mhm.
Those books are a lot of fun, and they're just exquisite, and Walter, when we had the opening, was one of the photographers who came, and he recalled receiving getting questions from kids about how he did these elaborate sort of all over images, and one guessed that he threw everything up in the air and then quickly snapped the camera and managed to get them in just
I
the
don't
right
think
position.
so.
No, I know. And then another thought he must have gone up in space where everything is weightless and got done it that way. So they really just the the wonderfulness of those images sparks all kinds of speculation
There's
and
just magic in
creative
the
thinking.
speculation. That's
Yeah,
right.
exactly. Yeah,
And of course,
so
the Walter Wick image of the ray of light, where I used to do science photography for
ah,
textbooks,
yeah.
and I'm remembering how. along a similar lines, how you weren't just trying to make another illustration that showed a scientific principle. You were trying to make something that was engaging. You were trying to make something that
Right.
would sort of draw someone in so they'd be interested in the idea of
Hmm.
what was
Yeah,
happening as well. And that's
that's right.
perfectly illustrated in that Walter Wick
That's right.
image.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I grew up with the TV show Mr. Wizard,
of course. Yeah.
and which was later followed by Bill Nye the Science
Bill Nye's.
Guy,
Yep. Yep.
and I think Walter is very much in that company,
Hmm.
of master explainers using compelling visual images to get kids to to ask questions and be fascinated by the world around them. I just want to mention another photographer who also belongs to that same grouping within the exhibition, Saxton Fryman,
Mm.
who took fruits and vegetables and
Oh,
saw
that's
the
right.
expressive possibilities of their shapes, and then added cuts and sort of Mr. Potato Head eyes, and with very minimal interventions on his part, turned them from something you would find in the supermarket into these
Real
faces
characters. Real
that
characters.
real
Yeah. Yeah.
characters that have recognizable feelings that children can see and then think about if they want to, when they look at the pages of his many books.
Absolutely. I mean,
And I hope he keeps making those forever. They're really extraordinary.
yeah, it reminds me a little bit of late 80s, early 90s, like puppetry for children too, a little bit with the way the faces are designed. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And then when I started to look back into the history of photography in children's books, I found a book from 1920 where a husband and wife team were taking cucumbers and pineapples and adding toothpicks to the pineapple to make a porcupine, and little eyes to the, and I guess whatever, to make a mouth on the
Yeah.
cucumber and so on, and presenting it as craft projects. So it was interesting to see people kind of reinventing the wheel, but each time, in terms of the technology that existed that for them, and possibly with different motives in mind. The 1920s people weren't so much thinking about developmental psychology, and I think Saxon Fryman was on a certain
Right.
level.
Right. Right.
So
There's
it all
an
involves.
appeal of the fruit and the vegetable that is very child friendly, very
Yeah, that's right.
non-threatening. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yep.
yeah, and there's a brilliance to what he does.
Oh
It's
no, yeah, they're
impeccable.
they're beautifully made. It's kind of the Edward Weston for children.
That's right. Yeah, 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 and you have to laugh, and what could be better than that?
That's right. That's great. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for
Well, thank
joining
you.
me and really
Thanks.
like teaching me a lot about children's books and
Oh,
children's book history because, we take it a bit for granted. We know it is how we want to engage with our
mhm.
kids and we want to
Yeah,
make them readers and engage in that way and have that tool in their toolkit, when
mhm.
they're older.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I said, you take a lot for granted, but it's a rich history. Yeah.
Oh, it absolutely is, and I think most of us experience children's books at, kind of in the foreground of our lives, either
Hmm.
something we remember when we were 4, or that we remember from reading to our, 3-year-old child at home, or grandchild. So it's kind of very, revelatory to take a big step back and see the bigger picture that they're a part of, which is, nothing less than our culture and our history.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you again.
You're most welcome. I really enjoyed this.
Oh,
Thank you,
great.
Michael. Yeah,
Yep. All right. Bye, everyone.
take care.
Real Photo Show is produced by me, Michael Chovan-Dalton. Music by Matteo Chovan-Dalton and Jim Raimundo. If you like the show, please rate and review with all the stars on your listening platform.